Princess Diana's private letter has been found, and it completely destroys Camilla's reputation. This is not just any letter, it holds painful truths about betrayal, cruelty, and things the royal family tried to keep buried. What shocking truth did she reveal that changes everything we thought we knew? Tune in, because once you hear what's inside this letter, you will finally understand why the royal family sent Diana to her final moments, a betrayal too big to hide. The revelations expose a power struggle unlike any other. She wasn't just Charles's mistress, she was a calculated force determined to keep her grip on him. Diana's letters make it clear that this woman manipulated Charles, feeding his insecurities and keeping him emotionally tethered to her even after he married Diana. The letters paint a disturbing picture of how guilt, flattery, and psychological tactics were used to keep Charles under control. Diana's frustration and pain are palpable as she describes how she was cast aside while this influence solidified. Before we go any further, one thing is certain: the truth in Diana's letters is far more devastating than anyone ever suspected. What she uncovered about Camilla will leave you speechless. But the manipulation didn't stop there. Her accounts detail how Charles himself became complicit in her suffering. His indifference, his emotional neglect, his complete disregard for her well-being, these are not the actions of a loving husband. He treated her struggles with cold detachment, making her feel like a burden rather than a partner. Her mental health was spiraling, yet Charles showed no concern. Instead, he maintained his affair, creating an environment where she felt completely isolated. The letters go further, describing the quiet complicity of the entire royal family. She was left to fend for herself while the monarchy turned a blind eye to the emotional warfare she endured. Even the queen, the supposed head of the family, did nothing to intervene. Her suffering was brushed under the rug, treated as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. These revelations call into question just how much the royal family truly knew and how much they were willing to ignore. She was not blind to this woman's role in all of this. She knew from the beginning that she was a problem, but her words reveal just how deeply she felt betrayed. She describes the influence as a poison, slowly eroding her marriage until there was nothing left. Attempts to save the relationship were futile, as this presence was a constant reminder that she was never truly wanted. The sense of powerlessness in her letters is heartbreaking. She was fighting a battle that had already been lost before it even began. Then there's the matter of Charles's blatant infidelity. Her words leave no doubt: he was never fully committed to their marriage. His affair wasn't just a fleeting romance, it was a full-blown emotional entanglement that made her feel completely invisible. The way she describes her pain, the loneliness, the deep sense of betrayal, it's impossible to read without feeling anger at how cruelly she was treated. Now that these letters are out, the question is, what happens next? The royal family can't just sweep this under the rug. The world now has her own words as proof of the betrayal she suffered. Camilla's reputation is in shambles, her carefully crafted public image torn apart by the truth. The weight of Diana's pain and suffering is impossible to ignore. The world sees Charles and his longtime lover for who they truly are, and there's no recovering from that. Diana never expected to feel like a stranger in her own marriage, but that's exactly what happened. She wasn't just competing for her husband's attention, she had already lost. Lost from the moment she stepped into the royal family, she felt like an outsider, and her private letters paint a heartbreaking picture of a woman trapped in a love triangle she never agreed to. King Charles was distant, emotionally checked out, and more devoted to another woman than to the one he had married. No matter how hard she tried to hold the marriage together, he refused to let go of his longtime mistress, and the damage became too much to repair. Diana hoped for love and loyalty, but instead, she was trapped in a marriage where betrayal was accepted and no one cared enough to stop it. The affair that broke a princess wasn't just a scandal, it was a wound that never healed. Her letters exposed the raw pain of knowing she was in a marriage built on lies. She wasn't naive, she knew about Charles's relationship, but she clung to the hope that love, commitment, or at the very least, duty would keep him by her side. That hope was shattered as Charles made it clear he had no intention of ending things. The betrayal was more than just emotional, it was a daily reality she had to live with. Every event, every royal obligation, every public appearance was tainted by the knowledge that the man by her side had already given his heart to someone else. But perhaps the biggest sting of all was knowing that Queen Elizabeth knew and did nothing. She believed the Queen had the power to stop the affair or at least address it, yet she chose silence. Her letters are filled with frustration, a desperate plea for acknowledgement from a family that had turned its back on her. She expected some form of support, some intervention, but instead, she was met with cold indifference. The Queen wasn't just aware, she allowed it to continue, and that silence spoke louder than any words. To the royal family, maintaining the image of the monarchy mattered more than the suffering of one of their own. Diana's pain was made worse by Camilla's complete lack of remorse. It wasn't just an affair hidden behind closed doors, it was out in the open. Camilla acted as if she had nothing to hide, showing up at events and inserting herself into Diana's world without a second thought. There was no attempt to be discreet, no concern for the heartbreak she was causing. Diana's letters describe moments where Camilla seemed almost smug, as if daring her to react. The worst part? Diana was powerless to stop it. She wasn't just fighting to keep her husband's love, she was fighting for basic respect, and losing. As for King Charles, guilt was never something that troubled him. If his wife expected an apology, she was waiting for something that would never come. Charles refused to acknowledge the hurt he caused, brushing aside her pain as if it were an inconvenience. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. When confronted, he dismissed her concerns, deflected blame, and carried on as if their marriage wasn't falling apart at the seams. His coldness was almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. How do you stay married to a man who doesn't even care that he's breaking you? Through it all, her biggest concern wasn't herself, it was her children. William and Harry were caught in the middle of a storm. Never asked for, she feared what growing up in such a fractured home would do to them. She worried about how they would see their father in the future, how they would process the knowledge that their mother had been cast aside. She tried to shield them from the worst of it, but how do you hide the truth from children who live in the public eye? The more she fought to protect them, the more isolated she became. She wanted out, but at what cost? She was trapped between her own survival and the well-being of her boys. Then there was Camilla's influence over Charles. Private letters suggest that Charles was never truly his own man. Camilla's presence shaped his decisions in ways the public never saw. It wasn't just about romance, it was about power. Camilla had a hold over him that no one else could, and that was clear in the way he treated his marriage. His wife wasn't just dealing with a husband who had strayed, she was dealing with a man completely under the influence of another woman. She was competing in a battle she had lost before it even began. No matter how hard she tried to save her marriage, Diana was losing, and the woman who had taken her place was only growing stronger. A marriage without a husband, King Charles was not just having an affair, he was letting Camilla call the shots. His wife noticed it early on, but as time went by, it became impossible to ignore. From royal engagements to family matters, Charles was making decisions with Camilla in mind, not his own wife. She could see how her role was shrinking, her influence fading, while Camilla's presence only grew stronger. Camilla wasn't just his mistress, she was the one steering the ship, and the woman he had married was left stranded. Private letters show how she felt like an outsider in her own marriage. The man who was supposed to stand by her side seemed more devoted to someone else. While the public saw a glamorous princess, she was fighting a battle behind closed doors. Every time she tried to assert herself, she was ignored, overruled, or simply pushed aside. Her role wasn't just diminished, it was practically erased. The royal family wasn't exactly rushing to support her either. Letters make it clear they were more interested in preserving their image than acknowledging her pain. She wrote about how, even as her marriage fell apart, they expected her to smile for the cameras and pretend everything was fine. Behind palace doors, there was no sympathy, no understanding, just silence. She was trapped in a system that saw her as an asset, not a person. Charles, on the other hand, had no problem showing where his loyalty lay. His wife wrote about how he would cancel plans, withdraw emotionally, and prioritize Camilla time and time again. It wasn't just an affair, it was a choice, a pattern, a deliberate act of placing one woman above another. Even their children weren't enough to shift his focus back to the woman he had married. She felt abandoned, humiliated, and completely powerless. And then there was the toll it all took on her, the stress, the betrayal, the isolation. It was too much. Her letters describe a deep sadness that only grew stronger over time. She battled anxiety, sleepless nights, and an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She tried to seek help, but the royal family's cold detachment only made things worse. It was as if they were waiting for her to break, expecting her to suffer in silence while they carried on as usual. Meanwhile, Camilla wasn't just staying in the shadows, she was moving in closer. It was clear how effortlessly she fit into the royal circle, how she gained favor with key figures, including the Queen. While one woman struggled for acceptance, Camilla was quietly cementing her place. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The very family that had resisted one of their own at every turn seemed to welcome Camilla with open arms. It made her question whether the royal family had ever truly been on her side. If they had wanted to, they could have stepped in, drawn a line, or at least acknowledged the damage being done. But instead, they let it happen. They let her struggle, let her suffer, and watched as she was slowly pushed out. Her letters are more than just a cry for help, they are a painful reminder of how easily she was discarded. Charles's relationship with Camilla wasn't just a scandal, it was a power shift. It was a clear message about who truly mattered in his world. And the most devastating part? The woman he had once vowed to stand beside had to watch it unfold, knowing that she would never be able to change it. She was fighting a battle she had already lost, and the royal family, they had made their choice long before she even realized she was in the fight. Long before she became a princess, Diana knew what it felt like to be alone, but nothing could prepare her for the life that awaited her. The royal wedding that hid a lie, Diana Spencer's life wasn't some fairy tale. It was a whirlwind, a spectacle, and at times a nightmare played out in front of the entire world. Born on the 1st of July 1961, she was part of an old, prestigious British family, but that didn't mean her life was perfect. Her parents' messy divorce when she was just a child left scars that never really faded. While the world would later see her as a princess, she was first a lonely little girl growing up in a broken home, already learning that appearances could be deceiving. Her childhood wasn't all glitz and glamour. She bounced between schools, never quite standing out academically, but she had a warmth that drew people in. She dreamed of becoming a ballerina, but life had other plans. By the time she hit her late teens, she was working odd jobs, helping at a nursery, babysitting, just a regular young woman figuring things out. But the second she got linked to Prince Charles, her life stopped being her own. It didn't matter that they had an age gap or that their relationship was more about royal duty than love. The public ate up the story of a shy young woman stepping into the world of royalty. Her wedding in 1981 was a global event, the dress, the train, the sparkling tiara. It was a spectacle, and the world couldn't get enough. But behind the fairy tale image, cracks were already forming. Charles was never really hers, his heart belonged to someone else, and she knew it. She played her role, smiling for the cameras, but the marriage was doomed before it had even begun. Motherhood became her refuge. When Prince William arrived in 1982 and Prince Harry followed 2 years later, she found a real purpose. She refused to let royal traditions dictate how she raised her sons. She took them on everyday outings, hugged them in public, made sure they knew love in a way she hadn't growing up. She wasn't just a princess, she was a hands-on, fiercely devoted mother, and the public adored her for it. But love from the people couldn't fix the disaster behind palace doors. Charles and his wife's marriage unraveled in full view of the world, affairs, fights, whispers of unhappiness. It was all out in the open. By the time their separation was announced in 1992, it wasn't even shocking anymore. The divorce, finalized in 1996, stripped her of her royal title but not her influence. If anything, she became even more powerful once she was free from the constraints of the palace. She took the pain she carried and turned it into something bigger than herself. She did not sit back or hide from the world. She threw herself into causes that many ignored. She visited people who had been cast aside, those suffering from AIDS, those battling leprosy, and those who had survived the horrors of landmines. She did not just stand at a distance and offer words of comfort, she reached out, touched hands, and reminded them they were human just like everyone else. When she visited an AIDS clinic and shook hands without gloves, she destroyed the fear that had kept so many people apart. The world saw that moment, and in an instant, everything changed. And who could forget the sight of her walking through a minefield in Angola? The danger was real. One wrong step could have ended in disaster. But she did it anyway, not for cameras, not for fame, but to show the world the suffering left behind long after wars had ended. She forced leaders to take action, and her work led to real change. This was not just charity work for show, she was changing lives, one act of kindness at a time. But the world never let her just be a woman with a mission. The press followed her everywhere, watching her every move, turning her life into a story for the world to consume. Every relationship, every vacation, every struggle, nothing was off limits. They turned her into a constant headline, leaving her no space to breathe. She was beloved, yet she was trapped. And then, in the summer of 1997, the weight of it all came crashing down. It happened in Paris, in the middle of the night, a high-speed chase, flashing lights, desperate to escape the photographers who never left her alone. Then a tunnel, a crash, silence. The woman who had spent her life in front of cameras, whose every step had been recorded, was suddenly gone. The world was left in shock, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The flashes of cameras that had followed her everywhere were still going off, even as her life slipped away. The chase had ended, but the loss was just beginning. Her funeral was unlike anything the world had ever seen, streets filled with mourners, millions of people unable to hold back their grief. World leaders, celebrities, and everyday people stood side by side, feeling as though they had lost someone they truly knew. But her greatest impact was never just in the headlines. It was in the way she changed what it meant to be part of the royal family. She broke barriers, showed emotions, and reminded people that even those in power could be compassionate. Her sons, now grown, carry that same spirit forward. They have walked their own path, speaking openly about their struggles, stepping away from traditions, and continuing the work she started. She may have been taken too soon, but her kindness, her bravery, and her impact, that will never fade. Did Princess Diana's letter finally reveal the truth about Camilla, or is there still more the royal family is hiding from the world? The impact of these words could change history, but will the palace ever admit it?